Some of the worst movies ever made were born from a unique and singular vision. They just turned out to be abjectly terrible misfires in the end though. Ones that would have been much better off if they'd been buried or locked away in the studio vault forever instead. So with that in mind, I am Gareth, this is Whatculture, and here are movies that suck so bad you can't believe they even got made. Dreamcatcher. Hollywood seems to be happy to continue with their latest Stephen King obsession, with projects based on the prolific author's works seemingly getting announced every other day. But based on how the last one turned out, it would be safe to assume that nobody is even going to contemplate touching Dreamcatcher. Quite how the movie turned out to be so bad is anyone's guess, especially with the talent assembled. Legendary two-time Academy Award winner William Goldman wrote the script, with Star Wars and Indiana Jones scribe Lawrence Kasdan behind the camera directing an ensemble that included Thomas Jane, Damian Lewis, Timothy Oliphant, and Morgan Freeman. Unfortunately, Dreamcatcher was quickly saddled with a reputation as perhaps the worst Stephen King adaptation ever, as the intended sci-fi horror thriller hybrid instead turned out to be an unintentionally hilarious and laughably incoherent misfire. That only redeeming feature comes from witnessing how cack-handed the entire thing is from start to finish. Swept away. Remakes, nepotism, and Madonna acting performances are three things that always have the potential to backfire spectacularly on their own. But when you put the three of them together, you end up with a disastrous Swept Away, a movie so bad that it set Guy Ritchie's career back by years. At no point do you get the impression that it exists for any other reason than Madonna demanded it, and Ritchie's first attempt at venturing outside of his crime comedy comfort zone will take some beating to be usurped as the worst thing he'll ever find his name attached to. Madonna blamed the press for the movie's failure after claiming they were actively trying to sabotage the collaboration between the then married couple. But the real reason Swept Away failed is that it is absolute garbage, and one of those rare projects that has absolutely zero redeeming qualities. But while we're talking about Mr. Guy Ritchie, I want to know what your favourite Guy Ritchie film is. It's probably not Swept Away, but you let me know what it is in the comment section down below. It's Bucky Larson, born to be a star. Adam Sandler has spent decades being hauled over the coals for his countless crimes against cinema, outside of Uncut Gems. But as the huge viewing numbers that his series of Netflix movies continue to rack up shows, the actor at least has a built-in fanbase. When his Happy Madison Productions company decide to make movies that Sandler doesn't even appear in though, the results are somehow worse. From the company that brought you such cinematic classics as Deuce Bigalow, Male Gigolo, Joe Dirt, The Master of Disguise, and Paul Blart, Mall Cop, comes Bucky Larson, Born to be a Star, which somehow combined to make all of those other dismal comedies look like classics by comparison. Star Nick Swardson has defended the box office bomb on numerous occasions, which only makes him look like a bit of an idiot, because as well as a deserved Rotten Tomatoes score of 0%, Bucky Larson is always and very rightly in the mix when it comes to naming the worst movies in the history of cinema. Well played. Guardians. As the superhero craze swept cinema and saw numerous other countries throw their hats into the ring in an attempt to play Hollywood at their own game, Russia stepped in and definitively showed how it should never be done. The concept of the Russian Avengers is enough to pique the curiosity, but trying to figure out exactly what the hell Guardians is supposed to be is an entirely different matter. A team of Soviet-era superheroes assembled during the Cold War that each represents a former state sounds like a weird cross between the Justice League and Captain Planet. But the end result is 10 times stranger and a whole lot worse than that. You can gauge the level of imagination that went into Guardians when you find out the titular team have such original names as Landman, Windman, Water Woman, and Wildman, who at least lives up to his moniker by occasionally transforming into a poorly rendered CGI bear. A sequel was originally announced that would have added a Chinese hero to the team, in a not at all transparent attempt to increase the commercial appeal, but after Guardians was roundly labelled by both Russian and global critics as one of the worst movies in history, any plans for a franchise were swiftly abandoned. Any Uwe Boll video game movie. Mercifully, Uwe Boll seems to have retired from the directing business. The The infuriating thing about the filmmaker is that his movies are terrible, he knows that they're terrible, but he didn't care and kept making them anyway. Surely the aim of any long-term career would be to show some kind of personal or professional growth, and not to just keep churning out utter crap out of spite. The highest rated of his video game adaptations currently holds a whopping 4% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, which pretty much sums up the overall quality of House of the Dead, Alone in the Dark, Far Cry, 3 Blood Drains, and 2 Dungeon Sieges, all of which could easily be ranked among some of the worst movies ever made. At one stage, he wanted to make a big screen version of Warcraft, but was told by owners Blizzard that we will not sell the movie rights, not to you, especially not to you, which pretty much tells you everything you need to know about both his skill and reputation in the industry. Gigli. Martin Brest had plenty of clout in the industry, having directed Beverly Hills Cop, Midnight Run, and Scent of a Woman. But the reaction to Gigli was so vitriolic that it essentially sent the acclaimed filmmaker into exile, and he hasn't directed a movie since. Ben Affleck and Jennifer Lopez have since seen their careers recover from their earlier days as a couple, when they were much better known for being tabloid fodder than anything they did on screen. But the Vanity Project could have easily marked the death knell for both. For some reason, Gigli ended up costing $75 million to produce, and roped in legends Al Pacino and Christopher Walken, only to tank spectacularly at the box office after failing to even recoup a tenth of the budget in theaters, and was roundly savaged by anyone unfortunate enough to see it, with the infamous gobble gobble scene the stuffed nightmares are truly made of. The Love Guru. Ever since The Love Guru landed with a dull thud back in 2008, Mike Myers' filmography has amounted to a few brief cameos, as well as stuff like a brief revival of The Gong Show on TV, most of which saw him buried under heavy prosthetics. Maybe Myers wanted to get out of the game, and actively set The Love Guru up to be a failure to accelerate his exit, because it seems hard to think of how anyone could end up creating something so bad on purpose. Austin Powers relied heavily on gross-out humor and running gags, but at least they had some heart and imagination. Borderline offensive, and not just to Hinduism, but anyone who was unlucky enough to witness it for themselves. It seems hard to believe that not a single soul at the studio gave the leading man a gentle tap on the shoulder and asked him what the hell he was doing. Mike Myers was once one of the highest paid, commercially successful, and popular comedy stars in the industry, and The Love Guru managed to torpedo his entire career and much of his reputation in the space of just 87 minutes. The Happening. M. Night Shyamalan's mid-career nosedive is what happens when a filmmaker truly buys into their own hype. Because based on how quickly the quality of his movies got staggeringly worse, the guy could have really done with a filter to stop him from thinking that all of his ideas were brilliant. Lady in the Water, The Last Airbender, and After Earth are all very, very bad movies. But they can't hold a candle to The Happening, which has admittedly gone on to enjoy a second life as a cult favourite based entirely on how hilarious it is. Which most definitely wasn't Shyamalan's intention. Mark Wahlberg talking to plants has endured as a meme, and the first section of the movie actually shows some promise in establishing the central mystery, until the foliage comes along and kills the entire thing stone dead. People start killing themselves in mass numbers in an unexplained global phenomenon, which is a great hook, until you find out that the culprits are plants, the environment, Mother Nature? It doesn't even seem like Shyamalan knows, and audiences certainly didn't give a damn. It works as a comedy, but when Shyamalan was scripting his deadly serious and relentlessly po-faced apocalyptic thriller, that would have been the furthest thing from his mind. Movie 43. Look at this image, which is indeed Hugh Jackman with a set of balls on his chin. That one photo manages to perfectly encapsulate both the level of star power involved in movie 43, and how lowbrow and dreadful the pitiful attempts at wringing out even a single laugh from the anthology ensemble turned out to be. A quick glance at the cast really makes you wonder if any of these people had even read the script. Because Jackman, Kate Winslet, Elizabeth Banks, Kristen Bell, Halle Berry, Gerard Butler, Richard Gere, Terrence Howard, Chris Pratt, Liev Schreiber, Emma Stone, Jason Sudeikis, and Naomi Watts could all easily name it as the worst movie of their career, and nobody could present a single compelling argument to the contrary. Anthology movies are always hard to get right, and movie 43 is the textbook example of how every single thing can be wrong, resulting in embarrassment for the gaggle of A-listers, and a fully deserved reputation as perhaps the single worst comedy to ever come out of the studio system. Battlefield Earth. John Travolta had already experienced the ups and downs of movie stardom before Pulp Fiction launched his second act as a leading man. But after starring in a string of critical and commercial hits, his decision to mount a big-budget love letter to Scientology marked the beginning of a downward spiral that his career still hasn't managed to recover from, really. Travolta was so enamored by Battlefield Earth that he genuinely thought he'd be able to convince Quentin Tarantino to write and direct it. But ultimately, George Lucas continued his turn-of-the-millennium quest to ruin sci-fi by suggesting his protege and the Phantom Menace's second unit director Roger Christian for the gig. At a cost of $73 million, Travolta was confident that Battlefield Earth would be his own version of Star Wars. Except better, as he once infamously claimed. But what he got instead was a huge black mark on his filmography that saw his personal beliefs used as a massive stick by critics to continuously beat him over the head with. The Emoji Movie. Following on from a movie focusing on some little iconic bricks unexpectedly proving that even the silliest sounding concepts have the potential to be a hell of a time in 2014, the Lego Movie's unlikely success likely left some who would usually be quick to run a mile from a movie about those faces found on your phone feeling cautiously optimistic. But the second that first trailer for this 2017 animated Tony Leondis directed picture dropped, those same folks soon sensed that everything would not be awesome when it came to this particular cash grab. Even those who swiftly recoiled at that first look at the legendary Patrick Stewart voicing some talking crap in the Emoji Movie could not have guessed just how much of an unmitigated disaster was on its way though. Slammed as an unfunny, uninspired and just plain lazy 86-minute experience, which also largely acted as a blatant advert for various smartphone apps, it was almost impressive just how poorly this dumb story of a multi-expressional emoji trying to become a standard one turned out. It didn't walk away empty-handed come award season at least, with the James Corden, TJ Miller and Anna Faris starring film bringing home the awards for Worst Picture, Director, Screen Combo and Screenplay at that year's Razzies. How a film containing jokes about sophisticated turds doing their duty was ever given the thumbs up emoji in the first place is anyone's guess. But here we are, Theodore Rex. In an impressive career that has spanned 4 decades, and seen her complete the performer infinity gauntlet known as the EGOT, winning an Emmy, Grammy, Oscar and Tony Award, the great Whoopi Goldberg has only one regret, and it comes in the form of a pretty disastrous 1996 dino buddy cop movie known as Theodore Rex. Here, Goldberg plays Katie Coltrane, a no-nonsense detective, and a character who eventually teams up with George Newbern's anthropomorphic Tyrannosaurus Rex. You know, that one whose name's on the title. The two then get to searching for a killer of various animals, containing the sort of cringe-inducing dialogue and poor special effects that'll make you wish you'd gone extinct a few million years before sitting through this prehistoric dud. Even New Line Cinema themselves eventually realized they were onto a loser here and opted against releasing the film in theaters. That made Jonathan Batule's Theodore Rex the most expensive direct-to-video movie ever when it finally dropped/flopped. It's not exactly hard to see why Goldberg initially tried to back out of a picture that required her to throw on a futuristic jumpsuit and trade dodgy lines with a goofy-looking Rex suit for 90 minutes. But the real question is how anyone within New Line Cinema with a pair of working eyes could have honestly taken one look at this weak concept on paper and seen anything other than a guaranteed failure on the horizon, the Star Wars Holiday Special. Following on from one of the greatest big-screen adventures of all time blasting into theaters in 1977, the decision was made to have the likes of Luke Skywalker, Han Solo and Leia Organa reunite for a spin-off film of sorts known as the Star Wars Holiday Special. Anyone expecting to once again spend 90+ minutes on the edge of their seats, however, were in for one hell of an unwanted surprise in 1978. Bringing to life a story centered around Chewbacca's Wookiee family on Kashyyyk, this Steve Binder-directed Life Day celebration would go down in history as one of the most perplexing and occasionally quite uncomfortable TV movies of all time. Now sure, it did at least boast the debut of the iconic Boba Fett in an animated segment, but this laughably bad holiday special was a spaceship crash that also contained stuff like Chewie's dad Itchy pleasuring himself with a virtual reality headset, and a song so awkward it'll make you beg for a carbonite timeout. Star Wars fans likely weren't the only ones who couldn't believe this atrocious spin-off was ever allowed to exist either, with the likes of Harrison Ford and co all understandably looking like they prefer to be anywhere else on the planet here too, Batman and Robin. In a time before Christian Bale, Ben Affleck and Robert Pattinson once again made The Dark Knight a menacing vigilante to be feared in movie theaters. The Batman franchise was in a far more cartoonish place in the 90s, but that still didn't stop the world of Gotham attracting big-name talents like Val Kilmer, Tommy Lee Jones, and Jim Carrey to the crime-fighting party, with the lighter Bat movie that was 1995's Batman Forever actually being an occasionally wonderful slice of silliness in the end. Carrey going, well, full Carrey in a green suit was a riot. The same could not be said for the bat-nippled catastrophe that followed Joel Schumacher's first bite at this particular superhero apple. Just about every single person attached to Batman and Robin's quest to take down the big bad Mr. Freeze and Poison Ivy spent the next few decades apologizing for this all-timer of a bad idea. Wooden performances across the board, terrible gags that missed the target with nearly every throw of the Batarang, poorly written characters, and the inescapable feeling that this brightly coloured George Clooney starring sequel was designed solely to move more merchandise. Batman and Robin was such an all-round flop, it forced Warner Brothers to reboot the Caped Crusader entirely, and it remains one of the first movies folks point to when discussing those big screen failures people still can't fully believe actually landed in front of a paying audience. Cats. Oh, you knew it was gonna be here, didn't you? On paper, the 2019 adaptation of Andrew Lloyd Webber's iconic feline musical Cats had an awful lot going for it. A director who'd proven himself capable of delivering the cinematic musical theatre goods in Les Miserables' Tom Hooper, an absolutely stacked all-star cast including names like Judi Dench, Ian McKellen, and Idris Elba, and it was even going to boast a new tune written by both Lloyd Webber and Taylor Swift, who would also be appearing in the picture. What could go wrong? Well, quite a lot actually. In the end, the hairball that was coughed up for release that Christmas was one of the most jarring of recent times. Along with its bland direction and some rather annoying turns from the likes of James Corden and Rebel Wilson, the call to create these kitties via performance capture technology, instead of just throwing the cast into some practical costumes, also left a bad taste in the mouths of those who endured this often painful 110-minute musical. But worst of all, the project actually even ended up landing in theaters with a number of noticeable CG errors, including the aforementioned Dench's wedding ring being visible on her, paw. Even after said mistakes were fixed, and an updated version of the movie was sent back into cinemas post-release, that still was not enough to save a once promising project from becoming one of the most disappointing flops of the last decade, and a movie many wish they could erase from their own memory, Jack and Jill. For a frustratingly long period of time there, the hugely underrated artist known as Adam Sandler opted to continually waste his talents in some of the most irritating comedy films ever to rear their ugly heads. Perhaps the worst and most ill-advised of the lot, though, comes in the form of 2011's Jack and Jill. This Dennis Dugan-directed comedy sees the Sandman taking on the dual role of the titular bickering twins, with the expected level of unfunny gags and stupid toilet humor, including Jill having a bad experience with some Mexican food, what is she like, present throughout this Sandler lowlight. One that also sees him in drag as Jack's sister. Al Pacino turning up to earn a paycheck as himself does at least offer a few flickers of hope. His Dunkachino dance number is a much-needed hit of genuine hilarity, but outside of Pacino's presence, the rest of this consistently annoying Sandler fest will make you question how the same person found blowing folks away with his masterful work in the likes of Uncut Gems and Spaceman could also be behind this sort of lazy and oftentimes offensive Razzie record breaker, winning 10 of them at that year's awards. There must have been a point there when even the bloke behind the likes of Little Nicky and Grown Ups felt he was onto a stinker when co-penning a script boasting everything from twin powers to excruciating fat jokes involving the crushing of a pony. Hilarious. But he still went ahead and made it anyway. Epic movie. While on the subject of utterly idiotic comedies that were somehow given the green light, remember when parody movies were regularly found infecting movie theaters all around the globe? No, not the genuinely brilliant kind like Mel Brooks' Young Frankenstein or Spaceballs. Those disastrous Jason Friedberg and Aaron Seltzer created projects, which typically spent an hour and a half trying to squeeze a few desperate laughs out of everything from the rom-com to the disaster movie genres. They're the ones I'm talking about. Without doubt, the absolute worst offender in a collection of movies that rarely rose above a 7% on the tomato meter, however, is 2007's horrendous attempt at poking fun at the action and adventure realm, Epic Movie. None of the jokes made are even remotely creative or close to comical, with Crib/Narnia mashups, nuts being cracked in Willy's Chocolate Factory, and the inspired renaming of a certain iconic pirate to Captain Jack Swallows being just a few of the examples of how dumb things get here. Perhaps more surprising than the fact this one ever made it into existence in the first place is then it somehow went on to make a staggering $86.9 million on a $20 million budget. Never mind what Regency Enterprises were thinking when they agreed to produce this nonsense. What were the paying public thinking, coughing up their hard-earned cash to watch this epic failure? Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey. Very few expected to ever live in a world where beloved childhood figures Winnie the Pooh, Piglet and the rest of the gang would make the shocking jump over to the genre of slasher horror. But that's exactly what went down last year after the original 1926 Winnie the Pooh novel entered the public domain in 2022, with British filmmaker Rhys Frake Waterfield choosing to create a creepy tale that sees Pooh and Piglet become vicious murderers. The end results were unforgivably terrible, however. After an admittedly quite disturbing opening scene which reveals that poor old Eeyore was eaten alive by their gang, the remainder of the critically panned movie feels like it was thrown together with little to no thought at all. The costumes are laughably crap. None of the gruesome moments which should leave you wincing produce the desired effect thanks to the bland way it's shot and cheap-looking effects, and it very much feels like a movie that was made just for the hell of it. It's also one that probably shouldn't have ever made it anywhere near a cinema, but its inevitable sequel after somehow earning $5 million worldwide was a little more well received. So expect this twisted childhood universe, Pooniverse was right there, come on, to continue throwing out a few more nightmares, unfortunately. Madam Web. Move over, Batman and Robin. The superhero genre may have just crowned its new worst ever movie in 2024. Exciting times. Rejected by not just audiences, but by its own cast members in the wake of its release, Madam Web has somehow achieved the remarkable feat of making Sony's other mess of a Marvel project, Morbius, look like a decent night at the cinema by comparison. The signs looked bad the second the picture's first trailer dropped late last year, with it very much feeling like this tale of Cassie Webb and a few future Spider-Women had been yanked right out of the mid-2000s and lazily thrown at a wall as Sony sat there hoping it would stick. Unsurprisingly, it didn't. But how a studio movie boasting a not exactly tiny $80 million budget and a rather talented cast managed to still be this wonky and trashy in the end will likely be studied for years to come. Some of the cheapest looking CGI of the last decade, a big bad that feels about as generic as they come, a collection of deeply wooden performances, particularly from a Dakota Johnson who appears to wish she was in another universe, uninteresting cinematography and a dodgy script. It's tough to imagine anyone working on this S.J. Clarkson directed flop thinking they were onto a winner during the creation of this Sony spider dud, Super Mario Bros. Speaking of bars being set rather low, the Super Mario Bros. Movie may not have been the most refreshing and thrilling animated feature of 2023, but it was a massive improvement on the last high-profile attempt at adapting this much-loved video game for the big screen, that's for sure. 30 years earlier, it was decided that Mario would be heading to Hollywood, but rather than going down the animated route, the iconic Plumber brothers were unleashed in full live action, with Bob Hoskins and John Leguizamo as Mario and Luigi respectively. Now look, the visuals seen throughout are actually admirably bold. However, the surreal picture never really feels like it understands its source material, with the vibrant Super Mario experience being replaced by a largely dark and gritty aesthetic. Add in things like the hugely creepy little version of Yoshi that would haunt the nightmares of kids worldwide, and a terrible script containing consistently poor dialogue that Cooper himself, Dennis Hopper, described as, well, the S-word, and you get a film that was destined to go down in history as one of the worst video game adaptations ever. Put simply, directors Annabelle Jankel and Rocky Morton didn't fully understand the assignment, and it is still amazing to think that anyone felt that this was the direction to go for the first ever Super Mario adventure in US cinemas. Crazy stuff.